This is our lecture number 43. This is on what I've called controversial issues in the biology of behavior disorder. So we're going to be taking a look at some things that you have to think about, especially in relationship to treating various behavior disorders with drugs. I mean, you have a pretty good foundation now in the biology of behavior, and again, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at some behavior disorders like addiction, for example, mood disorders like depression, psychotic-based behaviors like schizophrenia, and oftentimes, of course, the utilization of drugs becomes a very important tactic. So again, there are some things that you need to consider when you're, exploring the biology of these behavior disorders and diagnosis and treatment of those disorders. So let's begin this assessment by simply posing the question, are drugs always the answer? And clearly they are not. There are uh, uh, disorders that we're going to be talking about that do have a biological basis, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the treatment for them necessarily, the best treatment for them necessarily would be some kind of biologically based treatment, namely drugs. So this is something that you need to think about, you need to consider. There are cases, for example, where certain types of talk therapy may be every bit as good, if not better, than some kind of a biologically based drug therapy. So again, keep that in keep that in mind as we go along. So the major controversial issues here, certainly the whole area of alternative medicines, and we'll be talking about some of those as we go along. The side effects that you see with drugs, the one of the most enduring of all the controversial issues is this whole idea of are you really getting real change with drugs, or are you just getting symptom removal? Another issue, especially of late in the treatment of various types of childhood behavior disorders, is that of over medication, placebo effects, which is always an issue. And then I want to touch upon the cost of drug development, because I think that is something that you really need to have a good understanding of, in terms of how very costly it is to develop drugs and why it takes so long. So we'll look at these issues. And certainly the first one is these alternative medicines that, over the last 10, 15 years have produced, I think, some rather startling results. And one that I'll talk a little bit about is the one that you see here, St. John's wort. This comes from flowering plants of the genus Hypericum. And initially, this got its start over in Europe, where it's been used for a very long period of time in the treatment of depression. But these plants are harvested. They're purified and marketed in a pill. And they're sold as dietary supplements, and that has important implications for their control, as you will see. They're sold over the counter for treatment of depression. It's easy to obtain them in almost any drugstore, as well as any supermarket. But there's some issues surrounding them that you need to be aware of. Without question, this is the number one treatment now for mild depression. And the way in which it works is to block dopamine and serotonin receptors within the brain. The Food and Drug Administration in the United States does not regulate the sale of herbs, does not regulate the sale of dietary supplements. So one thing that those who are considering using it, and again, I would not use it without a doctor specifically being involved in supervising it. But the Food and Drug Administration does not regulate the sale of herbs. And one thing that we know for sure is that purity can vary from bottle to bottle. That's how it's manufactured. You know, the degree of purity simply is not regulated. There are side effects, namely gastrointestinal distress can occur as a consequence of using this. So again, um, as far as self-prescribing, I'm sure there's a lot of that goes on, but I personally would not use it unless I was being supervised by a physician. Here's what it does that also you need to be aware of. It activates liver enzymes. And oftentimes those liver enzymes are very important in terms of breaking down toxins. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. But it also decreases the effectiveness of other types of traditional medications like antidepressant drugs that we will be talking about a little bit later on. So I think these are all things that you need to factor in, and they certainly give us pause in terms of whether or not this is something that should be used in an unsupervised manner. Keep in mind, St. John's wort is effective, but only in cases really of mild depression. It will not treat very severe depression. Okay? Second controversial issue, there are many different side effects of drugs. And just to take the example of antipsychotic drugs, one of the things that occurs with chronic treatment is a disorder that is called tardive dyskinesia. And it's repetitive, purposeless movements. This individual that you see here is an individual that's being treated for psychotic behavior, being administered an antipsychotic drug, and you get this facial grimacing and tongue protrusion and lip smacking and puckering and pursing of the lips and rapid eye blinking. These are all side effects of chronic treatment with antipsychotic drugs. And again, keep in mind, you know, I think one of the most important things you have to keep in your mind is that, you know, there are shades of gray here. That is to say, it's not black and white. Sometimes these side effects are ones that we have to put up with. That indeed, if there is not some form of side effect from a drug, you know, we feel lucky. I mean, typically there are side effects, and you must balance it against the potential improvement for the patient. So again, this tardive dyskinesia and these, you know, rapid kinds of movements that occur can be very harmful and distracting and destabilizing for the individual. But again, the balance is that of, with these antipsychotic drugs, you're getting rid of delusional thinking and hallucinations. So again, there's a balance here, and we always have to be, you know, weighing the cost and the benefit. Another controversial issue concerns whether or not drugs actually are getting at the underlying problem of an individual. Yes, they are good oftentimes at dealing with and removing unwanted symptoms. But it may be that there are psychological treatments that are going to work better. Psychotherapy, behavior therapy, talk therapies. This is again something that's always in the mind of a clinician in terms of treating an individual with a particular drug. You know, again, maybe the effects of the drug in terms of unwanted symptoms outweigh any benefits. Maybe other kinds of treatments, non-biologically based, will work better. So again, these are all things that have to be considered. A fourth controversial issue is that of over-medication, and I think that we live in the present day in a culture in which we think that there is a pill for every single ailment that we have. You know, if we get up in the morning, we feel a little bit depressed, well, we have a pill for that. If around noontime you're, you know, feeling particularly isolated and down, then there's a pill for that. And maybe in the evening, you're really feeling down, and you know you need to, you know, something to kind of pick you up. I mean, this whole idea of there being a pill for just about everything is something that I think is very pervasive, not only in our culture, but in many other cultures. One of the big problems in this field, in the field of pharmaceuticals and the treatment of behavior disorders with pharmaceuticals, is the use of multiple drugs that can actually, you know, accelerate a particular problem and a particular disorder. So these are things that at one point, you know, were really not being monitored as well as they should have been. And I think that this is always a concern. And quite frankly, sometimes there's just not enough coordination that takes place in the clinical medical community, and an individual that's maybe seeing several different specialists, and record keeping sometimes is not as good as it should be. So again, the whole issue of over medication is one that is very troublesome. And just to give you a little bit more of an example of how you know, difficult this can be, talk for just a few minutes about attention deficit disorder, and what we now know to be the case, that there's a certain number of patients that really can be classified as bipolar. This researcher that you see here, the psychiatrist Joseph Biederman, believes that up to 20% of ADD children may in fact be suffering from bipolar disorder, in which they're going through mania and then depression, just like an adult would. So there's been a dramatic increase that's taken place in terms of the utilization of antidepressant and antipsychotic drugs in children in order to treat this. And the difficult part of all this is that oftentimes the dosages that are used in young children are very similar to what we see being used in adults. Now, unfortunately, one of the outcomes of this is that there are reports now in these bipolar children who are prescribed these antipsychotic drugs, and levels of those drugs, dosages and durations of treatment that are similar to what's used in adults. There have been cases of these individuals attempting, and in some cases, successfully committing suicide. So again, this is a problem, and this is something that we really, you know, need to be very aware of. And it's a very difficult part of treatment these days. This whole over medication that is taking place of these very, very young ADD patients that are also bipolar. You know, are we over medicating young children and putting them at significant health risk? Yeah, I think absolutely we are. And I think that this is something that really has to be tightened up in the field of clinical psychology and psychiatry. So over medication, you know, maybe it's both, maybe there's both increased need and increased medication. Unfortunately, there's no real good, reliable biomarkers that have been used in order to improve diagnosis of ADD individuals. And really, you know, distinguishing between an increase in the number of children affected and the simply changing values or trends in diagnosis is something that we also have to be aware of. So again, this is a very controversial area, this whole area of over-medication. Um, Another controversial issue is that of placebo effects. And I think that this has always been a concern, but of late there's been a lot of work being done with antidepressant drugs in which they've found that the placebos, the control substances, are as effective as the drug itself in terms of producing desired behavioral change. That's very concerning. Placebo effects, it's this measurable, observable, or felt improvement that we see. And that's not, can't be attributable to the medication itself. So that kind of a change in terms of, these placebo effects can be due to a lot of different things. Maybe it just so happens that the individuals showed spontaneous improvement, that they didn't really need the drug treatment after all. Maybe it's due to the fact that the individual is now experiencing much less stress. And that's why you're getting improvement. Maybe the behavior disorder was not properly diagnosed to begin with. Maybe it has to do with expectation. The subject thinking, well, I'm getting this treatment now, this drug, and I know that it's going to work for me. Kind of talking yourself into it. And there's also cases of classical conditioning that are operating that clearly document the kind of felt improvement that is observed. So again, this is an important area, these placebo effects, and we have to be aware of it, and we have to obviously monitor what's happening in these very important control groups that are used in these experiments, in these clinical trials. Now, the whole issue of drug development is one that I think students don't really have a good grasp of. And I think that, I want to give you a little bit of background in this area about drug development because, again, I think there's a lot of mythology out there. It costs in the neighborhood of about $80 million to bring a drug all the way through development and clinical trials and government approvals, and then ultimately bringing it to market. That's for a single new drug. That's what a pharmaceutical company has to expect to invest. Okay, that's a huge investment. Okay, and the other important thing here is that it takes about 15 years for the whole process to take place. This is obviously a very long period of time. This is why many individuals frustrated that they can't get a particular drug here in the United States because it hasn't yet gone through the necessary rigorous approval process. While they go to other countries in order to acquire those drugs. It's understandable, but at the same time, there are reasons why that process takes so long here in the United States, and a lot of it has to do with safety. Okay, so let me, walk you through this in terms of the various stages. And again, it's costly and it's very time-consuming. So the basic research phase, which lasts usually about 5 years, you're getting discovery of the drug and you're developing, ways of trying to synthesize that drug, efficient ways to do it. And then you're testing it with animals, okay, with an appropriate animal model. Then it takes about a year to begin the application process, to begin the clinical trials. You need to review all of the basic research that has been done, both inside and outside the government. Then we get into our human clinical trial phase, of which there are, about, 4 different parts really. Phase 1, which lasts about a year and a half, we're screening the drug for its safety, and we're finding the minimum safe dose. The cost involved with this is about $10 million. Another 2 years in this phase 2, where we're establishing the most effective doses and schedules of treatment. Cost here is about $20 million. Then the next 3.5 years, phase 3, clear demonstrations that the drug is therapeutic. That's what you need to be able to document. That's going to cost about $45 million. Then, about a year and a half, the application to market it, and reviews of results of the clinical trials by government agencies. That's obviously an incredibly important step. And that's about a year and a half. And then ultimately you get to selling to the public. Drug companies are constantly in the process of trying to recover the costs that are involved in the development of drugs, because it's only a very small percentage of these drugs that actually get this far and that you can sell to the public. So again, some controversial aspects of this. One, of course, is that these clinical trials require double-blind designs and placebo controls, where neither the patient nor the experimenter knows who's getting the drug and who's getting the placebo. That's an absolute must. There's also a need for what we call active placebos. When we talk about active placebos, what we're talking about is control drugs that don't have any therapeutic effect at all, but they do have side effects. Okay, and the side effects are similar to those of the actual drug. So again, there's no benefit to taking the drug in terms of its impact, let's say, upon a particular behavior disorder. They don't have any therapeutic effect at all, but the side effects that we want them to have the same side effects as the drug itself. Okay, so this is what we call active placebos, and this is an important part of the clinical trial. The length of time that is required is absolutely frustrating for a lot of patients. But, speeding up that process is something that we don't really want to tamper with too much, because then you're going to sacrifice the quality of the science that's being done, and that becomes a very important issue. Obviously, we want a drug to go all the way through the clinical trial process. We don't want to cut corners, and it's all about safety. So indeed, this is why it takes so long. And obviously, there are incredible financial issues here that are involved. Only about 1 in 5 of candidate drugs that actually enter phase 1 ever gain final approval. So drug companies, they want to be able to recoup their costs. So again, take a look at how much drugs cost, and unfortunately they cost a lot, because drug companies want to be able to recoup the investment that they've made in those drugs. There's also problems in terms of what we would call the impartiality of drug trials. Sometimes negative findings, there's examples of them being hidden by pharmaceutical companies. They sometimes want those negative findings to be suppressed. And that can have, terrible consequences for the ultimate, if that particular drug is actually approved. And then we have the whole issue of what we call orphan drugs. And what we mean by that is this: there are some disorders, behavior disorders. We'll use the example of the field of behavioral neuroscience and psychopharmacology. There are some disorders that, in terms of numbers, in terms of the number of people that are um, impacted, okay, by this very unusual disorder. It's very few. And you're asking drug companies to develop a drug that invest in it, and invest a lot of money, $80 million, to actually bring a drug to market that very, very few people are actually needing. So these are called orphan drugs. And what happens now is that drug companies pool their resources together in order to try to develop these drugs, which are used in the treatment of individuals that for a rare kind of disorder. So again, lots of issues here that you need to be aware of in terms of these clinical trials and how drugs are actually developed and their cost and why it takes so long. These are important things to reflect upon. And what we'll do next is we'll begin to take a look at addiction-based disorders. We'll take a look at that in our next lecture.